to the second podcast in our special edition series to celebrate National Rural Health Day. This three-part series was developed by the Minnesota Rural Health Conference hosts, the Minnesota Department of Health's Office of Rural Health and Primary Care, the National Rural Health Resource Center, and the Minnesota Rural Health Association. My name is Mark Jones, Executive Director of the Minnesota Rural Health Association, and I'll be your host today. I'm pleased to introduce our very special guest, Dr. Nicholas Lennertz of the Minnesota Department of Health. Dr. Lennertz is a physician working at MDH in the Division of Infectious Disease Epidemiology, Prevention, and Control as part of the COVID-19 response. He received his medical degree at University of Minnesota and completed his residency in preventive medicine at Johns Hopkins. Today, we'll be discussing the impact of COVID-19 in Minnesota, specifically in rural areas. Dr. Lennertz, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's always a pleasure.
All right, so let's get right into this. So tell us what's happening in Minnesota regarding cases and deaths, and what are the latest numbers looking like, urban versus rural, and what does it suggest COVID-19 and its impact on Minnesota?
As of November 10th, in Minnesota, there's been 201,795 cases of COVID-19 with 2,756 confirmed deaths due to COVID-19. Things have really gotten out of hand. We are currently averaging between 5,000 and 7,000 new cases reported to MDH per day, which you can imagine is much more than, we used to be down in the hundreds and then maybe 1,000. And this has just skyrocketed. And one of the reasons is that the proportion of tests that are being performed, the proportion that are coming back positive has really increased. In fact, it's nearly doubled the past few weeks. It used to hover right around 4 to 5% of all tests that were conducted came back positive. Now, as of November 5th, the proportion of tests positive is up to 9.8%. So we're almost at 10% of all tests are coming back positive. Along with that, the deaths have also been increasing. And so now we're currently above 100 deaths per week. And we're going to going past that, which is just driving this mortality rate as well. More disconcerting news, workplace outbreaks have reached a new high. They're at 101 outbreaks. Outbreaks in congregate care settings have also increased. They're at the highest rate right now. And in addition, there's 22 active outbreaks at correctional facilities, which is also an all-time high. And then finally, I just wanted to point out that hospitalizations and ICU admissions are increasing. The total number of patients who are hospitalized have reached a new peak. And as of November 2nd, there's over 1,000 patients hospitalized with COVID-19.
Numbers of cases increasing in various rural areas, especially in maybe counties that border states like the Dakotas or Iowa. We're seeing cases as far flung up in Cook County or Koochichang or Lake of the Woods counties. It's gone from sort of a very, there was always cases throughout Minnesota, but, from an urban sort of perspective where there's a higher density of population and easier transmission and more gatherings into all throughout the state. As people congregate and they move throughout the state and there are different activities that people partake in, and the spread has just moved out throughout the whole state. So it's been a priority of the state to increase testing and sort of just have testing available statewide for anybody who wants it at no cost. We want to make sure it's accessible and that it's available for everybody. And so that's been a big priority with us, because in order to identify COVID-19 affected individuals, you have to test them. You got to get a positive test.
The testing options and strategies in rural communities, are they ramping up? Is there a variety? Are the locations where we can access testing? Is it out there? Is everybody able to access testing?
Yeah, that's the goal. And having different platforms for testing, whether it be what's known as a rapid PCR or a rapid antigen test, or whether it's conducted with a nasal swab or an oral swab, or now these new saliva tests that are rolling out where you spit into a tube and you can just send it on in the mail. These are all ways to increase the capacity to process these tests. But also a lot of these tests can be done at a point of care. And so it doesn't require a huge laboratory with all this fancy equipment. You can literally do it with a small machine and get a positive test result right there. You don't have to wait. It increases sort of the ability for people to not only conduct the test, but also receive the results without waiting a significant period of time.
Who should get tested?
If you are symptomatic, and remember, the symptoms in COVID-19 can vary. It can be very, very mild. It can be just things like fatigue and obviously cough and shortness of breath and fever. But lethargy, loss of taste or smell, like these types of more subtle, mild symptoms, you should get tested. And a large proportion of cases now, we don't have any idea where the contacts came from. We really don't have an idea where this individual got it from. We need to be vigilant when it comes to testing symptomatic people. So if you're symptomatic, you need to be tested. If you have a known or suspected contact, let's say that you, a couple of days ago, you hung out with somebody and test positive for COVID, or you suspect, or they became symptomatic or something, even if you were wearing a mask, it doesn't matter. You need to get tested. So contacts need to be tested as well. And then, individuals who attend gatherings, and there's been a number of examples where we see individuals who will go to a concert or have dinner with friends at a restaurant or go to a wedding or a funeral or a demonstration or political rally or whatever it might be, where there's people congregating, especially indoors, but even outdoors, we've seen events where there's an outbreak. If you attend one of these types of events, you should be tested. And you should be tested maybe 5 to 7 days after attending the event, because these are the places where we're seeing the outbreaks. This is where transmission happens. And so the answer to who should get tested is, if you're symptomatic, if you've had a contact or suspect you've had a contact, or you're at a gathering, get tested.
From an epidemiology standpoint, can you explain close contact?
Yep. Let's say somebody, like the kid is sick, 102 fever, he's coughing, all that kind of stuff, and you were exposed to that individual, right? You got a dose of virus. So that virus is now sitting in your nose. Generally speaking, it's going to incubate for about an average of 5 to 7 days before you have symptoms, before you become truly infectious. If you're a contact of that individual during that individual's early quarantine period, it's not an exposure. Person who's sick, symptomatic, that they coughed on you, maybe you have the virus, maybe you don't. But let's say you have the virus, you don't have very much. You just got a little bit, right? It's going to take a time, and the incubation period is anywhere between like 2 and 12 days, anywhere in that period. Generally right around 5 to 7 days. And so it's going to take 5 to 7 days before they have enough virus that they actually become infectious. You're most infectious a couple days before symptom onset to a couple days after. If the contact of the case comes home and you are exposed to that individual before they're quarantined, because they're a contact of a case, they need to quarantine. But if you contact them or somebody else contacts them like on the way home or something like this, they're not considered a case yet. They're just quarantined. Otherwise, as soon as they walk in the door and they see everybody, that whole house then would be quarantined. And that's unsustainable. And one of the things is like that kid. So we contact that kid, and everyone who's in contact with that individual 48 hours prior to the identification of his case, they have to quarantine because they were exposed to him when he was most infectious. So they got to do it. But contacts of contacts, you don't have to worry about it.
All right, thank you. So you talked a bit about the change in the seasons, and the holidays are going to bring some gatherings with our families. Anything we need to know about best practices to stay safe, to keep ourselves safe, to keep our families safe, to keep our community safe?
Consistent and correct mask usage. The mask has to be clean. It has to be covering your nose. It has to be completely around you. And then while you're wearing the mask correctly, you need to maintain a distance of at least 6 feet from other people. A mask is not a substitute for social distancing. We have to distance from each other. We have to wear the mask consistently. Embrace being outdoors. And I know that's going to be hard with winter coming and everything, but it's the more we know that this is the key. This is the stuff that works. And so that being said, holidays are coming, and that's the time when everyone wants to get together and spend a lot of time indoors with each other and hug each other and have a great time and all that kind of stuff, which is exactly what we don't recommend. And so vigilance is key. Vigilance. I know people are getting tired. There's COVID fatigue out there, and people are wondering when this is going to end. And I can't stress it enough how important being vigilant is. Come up with creative ideas for holiday parties. Have them over Zoom. My father-in-law just had a 75th birthday party over Zoom, and while it was kind of odd, it was kind of fun at the same time. This is critical, but I cannot say it. Like, holidays and pandemics don't mix, and when you try to mix the two, and we've seen multiple examples of this, weddings and funerals and gatherings like that, outbreaks occur, and I can't stress that enough. Please please come up with different creative strategies to spend the holidays with family, but maintaining that all of those social distancing, universal masking type of recommendations as well.
The CDC website also has great information for specific considerations around holiday gathering. Check that out for more information.
As we've seen and may continue to see increase in spread, increase in numbers in our rural counties, any thoughts on how this might affect our rural hospitals?
We're already seeing increasing numbers of individuals hospitalized. And that's a big if this spread and surge continues, and that's why we're very worried about Thanksgiving and Christmas and maybe college students returning home it's difficult to predict. There are so many different factors. We are concerned that the hospitals may have that surge where we're going to be questioning, what is the capacity of the hospitals? And, are there enough beds? Are there enough ICU units? Are there enough ventilators? This type of thing. We're not there yet, but it's always in the back of our minds. And it's very, very difficult to predict. A couple of things that I do want to mention is that from a hospital setting or from a healthcare facility setting, one of the things that we're really struggling with right now is COVID fatigue among healthcare workers. Healthcare workers have been on alert, a heightened sense of anxiety for months and months and months and months. And we're starting to see outbreaks among healthcare workers just because it's hard to maintain that level of vigilance for such an extended period of time. And so one of the things I would hope to stress to any healthcare facility, hospitals, acute care facilities, skilled nursing facilities, is to try to come up with strategies, increase the vigilance, but reduce the stress and the burden on the healthcare workers themselves. If you have a burned out staff, you're going to possibly increase risk for unintended transmission. You let your guard down, you maybe, are in the break room for too long and not wearing your mask properly and things like this. And obviously we want to limit that as much as we can. But COVID fatigue among healthcare workers and hospitals is very real. And I think that's something that we need to really pay attention to.
As an epidemiologist, what would be your best advice you could give to our rural hospitals, our long-term care facilities, our assisted livings, anybody that is working in the delivery of healthcare, taking care of our friends and neighbors and families?
Healthcare workers are very cognizant inside the facility to use PPE to do all the infection prevention and control sort of practices that they're trained in doing. What we're seeing then those individuals going out and becoming infected out in the community unknowingly, and then bringing it back into the facility unknowingly. And I probably said this, I can't tell you how many times, but the aspect of vigilance and understanding that it doesn't take much to become infected, to infect others, or to sort of have like a situation that results in an outbreak. It doesn't take much to do that. And this is one of the problems is that, it really didn't take much. We just opened up a little bit on a societal level, and all of a sudden you started seeing cases just increasing. As far as, what can hospitals do and things like this, it really comes down to creating an environment where healthcare workers, all staff, are able to be vigilant and understand that this is even the smallest little breakdown or breach in the defenses can cause a huge outbreak. We've seen this time and time again. And what we can't afford is we can't afford to lose healthcare workers, who become infected. We certainly can't have an outbreak among healthcare workers in a facility. We've seen long-term care facilities struggle mightily after they've had several healthcare workers become ill and have to isolate and things like this. And they become very short-staffed, and then they can't care for the patients who are residing there. And the fear is that when we have this COVID fatigue and people just become tired of doing this, we have widespread transmission in the community. There are so many ways to become infected and to transmit it right now that we have to maintain a state of vigilance. And for hospitals, it has to be not only in the hospital, but outside as well.
My next question talks a little bit, just a question on the data and what we're seeing in our Black, our Indigenous communities of color in Minnesota. If you could speak to it as far as our rural communities and some advice for hospitals and communities and what they can do to make sure that any barriers that do exist are addressed.
You're absolutely correct. And this has been a focus of MDH since the beginning, because we understand that vulnerable populations, including different racial and ethnic individuals, they are disproportionately affected by all sorts of things. And COVID-19 is no exception. So what we've seen right now is that when we look at the impact of COVID-19, African-American populations, American Indian populations, Hispanic populations, hospitalization rates, ICU admissions, and deaths are all significantly greater than for the white population. There are numerous factors that contribute to this, whether it be certain demographic factors, socioeconomic factors, access to care. You can look at rural populations and maybe they have limited access to care. Maybe they have distrust of the healthcare system. There are numerous hypotheses as to why this is, but the fact of the matter is the number of cases among Blacks per 100,000 people is 4,697 compared to whites, which is 1,370. So it's almost 4 times greater the number of cases among Blacks than it is among whites. You look at hospitalizations per 100,000 people, 64 in the white population. It's 547 for Blacks. It's 339 for American Indians, and it's 541 for Hispanic. I mean, it's compared to 64. I mean, these numbers are astronomically higher. And the same, it goes for mortality as well. I mean, the numbers for Blacks, American Indians, Hispanics are significantly elevated. Some of the things we're trying to, we have different task force working with, our American Indian tribes and working with sort of vulnerable populations. This is just data regarding ethnicity and race. It doesn't include populations such as those that are currently incarcerated or those that are suffering from home insecurity or groups like this, but the numbers are similar. This is a system-wide problem, not specific to COVID. And we see these similar types of rates with other diseases as well. I think it goes beyond just COVID. I think we need to just sort of readdress the bigger picture. There are various physician groups in Minnesota that are advocating for changes to reduce these systemic barriers for vulnerable populations. But I think it will take a concerted effort from multiple groups, including community organizations, governmental organizations, hospitals, academic institutions, et cetera, to come up with a measured plan with specific outcomes in order to try and tackle these incredibly complex issues.
All right, thank you. So let's move on to the science of COVID-19 and anything new out there in the scientific world we should know about.
Yeah, as we move along, the data keeps coming in and supporting the use of social distancing and masking and things like that. A couple of interesting, we're getting more and more data from genetic sequencing of COVID-19. And COVID-19, it was originally the whole genome was sequenced back in January. And so what we've started using sequencing for, as we've ramped up our ability to sequence samples and to compare them, is that we've been able to use whole genome sequencing in conjunction with classic epidemiological investigation. So if that you have a whole bunch of sick people and you call them and you ask them, where were you? And they said, oh, we were all at this party last Saturday and now we're all sick. What we can do is we can say, well, that's likely where they were exposed, but do we have more data or conclusive sort of evidence on this? And one of the ways that we can sort of add to that evidence is to use sequencing. And we can look at the genomic sequence of all the different samples from those individuals who we suspect were infected. And we can compare them to see whether or not genetically they are related. And that's been really interesting because we've been able to identify sort of related clusters and transmission patterns from different facilities. And this is not just Minnesota that's doing this, but all over the country and all over the world, actually, to look at sort of relatedness and whether or not it takes, let's say you have an outbreak, does it take multiple strains or multiple introductions to cause the outbreak, or is one sort of introduction sufficient to cause a massive outbreak? And so the use of whole genome sequencing has really allowed us to sort of shine a light on outbreaks and the transmission patterns of the virus. And when I mentioned previously about you have to be vigilant, it doesn't take much. Sequencing supports that statement because we can look at an outbreak and there may be 50 positive cases associated with this outbreak, and they're all coming from a single introduction. They're all related, every single one of those viral genomes. And so it provides a little bit of clarity as far as, it really doesn't take much. You got to maintain that vigilance. And so that's an interesting tool. The other issue that will be coming up, and I believe that the hospitals and the clinics are already seeing this, is people who come back and they will test positive a second time. And so let's say an individual becomes symptomatic with COVID symptoms. He goes to his clinic back in April. He's tested and this individual tests positive. He stays home for his 10 days of isolation. His symptoms resolve and then he's fine. Okay. Fast forward 4 months, he all of a sudden decides to have that hernia surgery that he's been meaning to get. And so he goes into the hospital. He's asymptomatic. He feels totally fine. They do a COVID test on him prior to surgery, which is a standard operating procedure, and he tests positive. What does that mean? And so there's an issue of what we call persistent positivity, or individuals who will continue to test positive after resolution of their acute infection. And so there's been some investigation into how long individuals can continue to test positive without evidence of infection. Recently, in the past few weeks, there have been maybe 10 or 12 now of reports of individuals with true reinfection, or reportedly true reinfection, which means that you got COVID-19, cleared the infection, a significant period of time has passed, and then there's evidence that you were infected again. Sometimes these individuals are infected and they're asymptomatic, and it's just through the screening they test positive again. Sometimes they have mild symptoms. Sometimes they have more severe symptoms. And again, this is probably 10 or 12 in the literature. It's not that many yet, but what they have done is they have looked at the genetic sequence of the initial infection, and then they have looked at the genetic sequence from the subsequent infection and compared those two. And in several of them, they have found that the sequences are actually different. We're going to have more and more data and information on this coming up, but this is something that I think individuals are going to start wondering about, is people are going to be testing positive again a second time, and what does that mean? And so far, most of the time, it's just this leftover virus hanging out in the upper respiratory tract, in your nose, in the back of your throat. More to come on that. That will be interesting over the next 6 months or so.
Absolutely. Always learning. And I think another great reason for testing, so that the more we test, the more people like you learn and then can teach us. So it's fantastic. So Dr. Lennertz, as we close, any final thoughts and how can we learn more about this? Where can I go to find out more information?
I recommend 2 resources. MDH is constantly updating guidance. And then obviously the CDC COVID-19 website. That also has the most up-to-date guidance. Those are going to be your 2 resources for pretty much everything you'll need to know. The latest information regarding persistent positivity, quarantine, isolation, testing standards, it's all in there. MDH and CDC both have a wonderful section on healthcare workers. What I would recommend is not going on some of the other more questionable sites regarding information. You'll find those on various social media platforms. CDC and MDH, that's where I would recommend going.
Dr. Lennertz, thanks so much today for joining us. On behalf of the Minnesota Rural Health Conference hosts, I'd like to thank all our listeners for tuning in. To access other podcasts in this series, click on the links in this podcast description or visit our conference website at minnesotaruralhealthconference.org/podcasts. We hope you have a great day, celebrating the power of rural in your community. Happy Rural Health Day, everyone.